easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Community Classroom. This is Dr. Tracey McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are addressing clarity in the classroom and getting on the same page. And what we're going to be addressing are things like guidelines for commenting and community behavior. We're going to be addressing some clarifications regarding some terms and words and definitions that we've been using and that have been used in various conversations around these issues related to ancestry and heredity and things like that. We're going to look at some issues related to people and identification. We're going to look at this question. We're going to look at a few questions, but one question we're going to look at is this question of whether the United States is a country or a corporation. We're going to look at whether the identity of Indian or Native American is a race or a status or both. We're going to also look at distinctions between two groups of people known as the Aramites and the Edomites, or the Arame and the Edomi. We're also going to look at some issues related to some potential clerical errors in translated Bibles related to the Arame and Edomi. We're going to also look at clarifications regarding the distinctions between Ouida, Benin, and the former kingdom of Ouida, also known as Judah. We're going to look at some questions about King James, so we're going to continue that conversation about King James. And we're also going to look at some questions about the ancestry of people who currently identify as African. And then we're going to culminate with quick discussion questions regarding the Sestake Trust, and hopefully clarifying some of these issues or bringing them to the forefront will make your research and future discussions go a little bit more smoothly.
Someday when you hit us much lighter.
Okay, so let's quickly go over the guidelines. We shouldn't have to go over these guidelines, but apparently based upon the comments and YouTube holding a number of comments for profanity and bad words and things like that, we're going to go over these guidelines for the community classroom. Now, clearly, people do all sorts of things on a variety of channels on YouTube, and some YouTube channels are pretty much R and X rated, quite frankly. However, on this channel, this is a G-rated or PG-rated channel. And so these are the guidelines for the channel. So there will be no profanity. So if the comment includes profanity, it will be held by YouTube and then it will not be posted. No name calling, that means against individuals or groups. No slander or libel. Defaming anyone, on the channel or on YouTube, anything like that. No demeaning of other people in the comments, and no religious or political badgering. That has become an increasing issue, and no spamming or flaming, and that's a consistent issue that has been going on for quite a while. So those are the guidelines, and hopefully that will allow the discussions to flow more smoothly. It will also facilitate an increase in the discussions as people feel more comfortable commenting and they don't feel like they're going to be attacked for not having an opinion or a perspective that gels with someone else's opinion. And so hopefully these guidelines are going to be helpful and will set the stage for a nice foundation for some healthy, growth-inspiring discussions.
Together and we'll get it undone. Someday when you hit us much lighter.
Okay, so the first question we're going to address is whether the United States is a country or a corporation. For some odd reason, this issue has been floating around the internet, and a number of people believe that the United States is a typical corporation. And not only that the United States is a corporation, but that people, the citizens of the United States, are shares that are traded on the stock market. And so we're going to address the question of whether the United States is a country or a corporation. Before we go any further, though, one of the things that I want to encourage people to do is if you have legal questions, serious legal questions, you are encouraged to consult an attorney. There are lots of people who are on the internet. It could be on Twitter, Facebook, it could be anywhere that might be handing out legal advice. And you need to know, if you are taking legal advice, that it is legitimate legal advice and it is a legitimate analysis of the law. Now, this is not to say that every attorney is going to be right in terms of interpreting a particular legal issue, but for some of the things that are going around, an attorney is more than able to provide insight into these questions. And so you can even just show the person the law and ask them, does it say what you think it says? And this is important because people are often investing money in response to some of these things that are going on the internet. And so before you invest any further, let's clarify this question here. Now, first, let's start off with the question of whether the United States is a country. And yes, the United States is a country, and a country is basically a nation that has its own government, and it occupies a particular geographic territory, so a particular geographic space. And it's known by, many names, and there's a list on the screen. And the United States is definitely a country, and it has a government, and the government structure is basically the three branches of government, and you also have three levels for each of those branches of government. And so this is not the way that a corporation functions. This is the way that a government functions, a country functions, and this is pretty much the way a sovereign functions across the world, whether we're talking about a small sovereign or a large sovereign. And so as a reminder, the legislative branch is the branch of government that makes the laws. They create the statutes, the laws that are on the books. The judicial branch interprets the laws that are on the books, and the executive branch, their job is to enforce the law. Now, because of the way the branches function in reality, sometimes you have a situation where the executive branch, of course, is interpreting law. And because of the prosecutorial discretion that goes on with law enforcement, often law enforcement is interpreting laws and also enforcing law at the same time. And accordingly, because of the role of the judiciary is also enforcing the law depending on the circumstances. And so there's a little bit of interplay going on there, but the branches are distinct in terms of what they are supposed to be doing. And so there is some clarity and there is distinction there. But long story short, the United States is a country. It's not a corporation. And fortunately, we were able to trace down where this line of thinking came from. And what has happened is that, and it's unclear, where it all started, but I guess it started with one individual reading the U.S. Code, Title 28, and coming away from that reading with a belief that the title was saying that the United States is a corporation. And so when you read it, it's easy to see how someone might misunderstand that. But what this is basically saying is that the United States, in quotation marks, means these things that are listed under 15, A, B, and C. So there could be a federal corporation that is under the umbrella of the United States, an agency, a department, commission, board, or any other entity of the United States or an instrumentality of the United States. And so basically what they're saying is that these entities are considered the United States. So they go under the name of the United States. So if the United States has a corporation, a federal corporation, if there is an action against a person by that federal corporation, that would be an action by the United States. Likewise, if someone was harmed by something related to this corporation, this federal corporation, they would be technically harmed by the United States. The same thing with U.S. agencies and departments, commissions, and boards. And so another thing that has come up is this belief that corporations have all capital letters, and that this is somehow tied to the birth certificate and the entire issue about trading people on the stock exchange. And so there's this belief that the capital letters indicate that people are corporations. And as you can see, there are some samples of corporations up here, and you can see that corporations are not necessarily in all capital letters. You have Allstate, Macy's, and Amazon. And so the all capital letters, it's unclear where that idea came from, that equates to a corporation, but that is simply not true. Usually capital letters are used because of clarity. So you can read it, it's easier to read, it's easier to make out, it's not as ambiguous. And so no, when you read this, it does not say that the United States is a federal corporation. Okay, and so there are also a couple of federal quote-unquote corporations that are on the screen that you can see that are operated by the United States, are chartered by the United States, and those would be technically federal corporations. Now, of course, some of the confusion also might be this idea that a corporation is technically a person, and so some people might have thought that also went in reverse, but it does not. And so a person is a person, and a corporation is a corporation, and a government is a government, even though there may be corporations that are subsumed under a governmental entity. Again, for something as simple as this, you could probably, talk to a librarian at a law school who could, help with reading a small passage like this. So if you don't have an attorney available that could just look at this and tell you what it is saying, you could go to a law library. You might even just talk to a regular librarian. They might be able to help you. There are also legal aid offices. You can contact any of those that might be able to give you some quick assistance. Now what we're going to address is the question about Indians, indigenous people, original people, aboriginal people, natives. We're going to quickly look at the question of whether this identity is a race or a status. And sometimes it can become very, very confusing. And some of the debates that are going on, those debates really are about this question of race or status. There are a few other things that are going on with the debates, but the question of race or status is an underlying issue, and hopefully a little bit of clarity regarding this question will make understanding the dynamics and some of the assertions that people are making, maybe it will make it more palatable and more understandable so that there isn't so much contention going on. And one of the things I want to point out is that a number of people, when they approach these issues, they approach them from the vantage point of historical analysis. Some people might look at some biology, they might look at all sorts of research related to genetics and things like that. But this question really is a legal issue, and the courts have been instrumental in determining the extent to which an Indian is a racial classification or simply a status. And so it's really important to actually look at older legal cases that address this issue. You can also look at law journals to get some idea of how this question has been addressed. And there's a really good, it's long, but there's a really good law journal on making Indians white, and it looks at the hidden history of identification for Indians in terms of race versus status. And if you have access to LexisNexis or something like that, you should be able to readily get a copy of this article. Now, one of the things that we need to look at is the issue of all of those words meaning different things. And so sometimes people are using them interchangeably, but in terms of the legal definitions, they don't all necessarily mean the same thing. And the etymology is different for the various words. And so as you can see, Aboriginal is probably the construct that most people are trying to assert when they are talking about this identity. And Aboriginal basically simply means first in time. Okay, so that's what it is in a nutshell. And this is the thing that gets caught up in the confusion. And so there are all of these other words and all of these other constructs, and people are looking at the identity as an issue of race, when really what people are talking about when they're identifying themselves as Aboriginal is they are basically saying that they are the first in time. And so what ends up happening, however, is that people are hearing that individuals are saying that whatever their identity is, their skin color, things like that, whatever that identity is the first in time. And so it can get really, really confusing. And so being Aboriginal is not about anyone's race or really anyone's ethnicity. It's really about being descended from an ancestor that was here first. Okay, so, or wherever first, wherever you are, they would be first. That's why Canada refers to the nations as the First Nations. They are identifying that they are first in time. It doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter what their racial classification is. You could have a bunch of different racial classifications. The issue is about being first in time, because the issue is really revolving around some legal dynamics. And so it's really about status. It's really not about race. And what that means is just because there are brown people who were here first. That does not mean that because an individual person is a brown person, that they are linked to those brown people who were first in time. And so that sometimes gets confusing for some people. They think that there is a direct correlation between there were brown people here first, there were some brown people that were here first, and they sometimes think that that automatically means that all of the brown people are directly descended from the people who were here first. And so when people are making that claim of being Aboriginal, they do need to produce something, not publicly necessarily, but they do need to produce something to show, to demonstrate that they are descended from an individual who was here first. And it doesn't really matter who the individual is who was here first. It doesn't mean that every single relative that they ever had, they came from people who were here first. It simply means that they have some direct line to an individual who was here first, or from a group that was here first. And this doesn't just apply in the Americas. This also applies in other places. It could apply in Africa. There are a lot of people in different places in Africa, and they were not there first. Sometimes they came and took over the land. They colonized the land, and there were other people there before them. And so they would not have been first in time. So they may not have been Aboriginal. And there are several tribes, several nations in Africa that identify their roots as Asian roots, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so they do not see themselves as originating in Africa. So a lot of these conversations are really, really interesting, because a lot of people in the Americas, and primarily from the Caribbean, a lot of individuals are insisting on this sort of Africa First identity. When the individuals that they are talking about in terms of that Africa First relationship, those individuals in Africa have identified themselves as coming from the Levant. They've identified themselves as coming from the Middle East. And so you have some individuals in the Americas, in the islands primarily, basically identifying and defining who quote unquote Africans are, and by extension defining who quote unquote Americans are. And so it's one of the reasons why boundaries are so important, and it's so important to allow people to define themselves, because sometimes people have all sorts of thoughts and fantasies about who people are, but they really don't know these various groups. And in the Americas, there may be a tendency to assume knowledge and awareness and expertise about other groups, when that expertise is a presumed expertise and it's not really based on reality. And so you also have indigenous, which basically means you are born in a particular place. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you are first in time. And so it's very important in terms of that distinction. A person can be indigenous, but that does not mean that they are Aboriginal. They are the original. And also, sometimes people are careful about using the term native, because native has a couple of connotations, and one connotation is related to slavery. And so sometimes people are careful about using that term. But of course, people should use the term that is applicable. So if a person is indigenous, they were born, they are quote unquote native to the land, then indigenous is an appropriate term to use. However, when someone says Aboriginal, it means something specific, and it really is about a status. And so accordingly, the Virginia Indians, they are Aboriginal, okay? So that's why there's, a lot of fighting that's going on related to their rights and their rights not being respected. They really are a First Nation. They are First Nation groups. And they, however, are being marginalized, and they have historically been marginalized. And part of that marginalization comes from legally classifying them as something that they are not. And so the Making Indians White article, that's a really good article for you to get an idea of how the legal system came to marginalize those groups of people and the history behind that, the process by which this marginalization took place. And for many people, there is a belief that whatever it is they've been told previously about the identity of people, that is the absolute unmitigated truth. And what has happened, however, in terms of American history, is that there was a process whereby individuals, even though they were Aboriginal, legally they were classified as not Aboriginal simply because of their skin color. And so having the skin color resulted in those individuals being classified as something other than what they were. And so they were not allowed to be classified as Indians. They were not allowed to be classified as Aboriginal. And so this set the stage for a lot of legal and historical crazy making. And this resulted in a lot of their rights being taken from them based upon this playing around with reality. And so what happened was, if a person looked quote unquote white, then they could be more readily classified as Indian or Native American. If a person looked brown, however, they would be more likely classified as Negro or mulatto, but they would not, in many instances, be allowed to identify as who they were. And part of the reason there were so many issues related to skin color is that the Virginia Indians were darker, and they seemed to have a phenotype that was similar to some of the Africans that were coming over. And so there was a difficulty with distinguishing between the Virginia Indians and the Africans that were coming over. There was also, I'm hoping that some of you have been doing your research, there were also a large number of brown people that were coming over from Europe. And so there was difficulty for some people in this emerging racialized paradigm. There was difficulty with distinguishing between all of these different groups of people. And so you had these quote unquote Creoles, and there was just a difficult time with separating them, with distinguishing. And so there was just this idea of using color as the line of demarcation in terms of identifying ethnicity and quote unquote race. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of confusion going on when there was an insistence by the governmental entities at that time. There was an insistence on telling the Indians that they were black, or identifying the Indians as African when they were not African. And of course, this was done in large part to usurp their rights to the land, their rights to the resources. And so this wasn't really so much about people being confused as it was about creating confusion so that individuals and whole groups would not be able to avail themselves of the rights that were theirs.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier.
Aramite or Edomite, are they the same? This is an important question, and it's an important question for a number of reasons. There is a scripture that basically talks about how an individual is supposed to relate to an Edomite and an Egyptian. And that word actually is Edomi, but it looks like Edomite and it looks like Aramite. And so we tend to say, use that ite at the end of those words there, but it's really the E sound. So anyway, there is apparently some confusion, and we're going to try to clear up some of that confusion. If people have some more insights regarding this, feel free to share in the comments section, and hopefully people will get more clarity through discussion. Now, Deuteronomy 23:7 is the scripture that addresses this. And as you can see, there are a variety of translations. And we're looking at a variety of translations because there is the suggestion in Strong's Concordance that this was just a King James Version clerical error. And so what we see, however, is that there is consistency. You see the word Edomi, the people, Edomi, throughout a variety of translations, and there are more. These are just the ones that could fit on the screen here. And you might be asking, why is this important? Well, it's important because there is an indication in the Strong's Concordance, if you're doing some research, that there is a clerical error, and that the wrong word or wrong people might actually be inserted into this particular scripture. So again, if people have more insight, that would be great, but we're going to move on and look at these two groups and how this might have come about. Now, in the actual Strong's Concordance, the book, the real book, what you might notice if you are researching the Edomi is that you will eventually come across this notation that says that there is some sort of clerical error, and it's unclear about whether they are talking about the Arame, the Aramites, the Arameans, or whether, which is a Syrian, a group, or whether you're talking about the Edomi. And so you can see down at the bottom right hand corner there that there is this notation about that, and it's also in the Strong's Concordance, the actual concordance. And so there's some explanation, doing some research, there seems to be some explanation suggesting that the way that it was historically written, it looked, these two words look similar, and so that's where the confusion came from. And so it's an interesting confusion, however, because you're talking about two totally different groups, and you know, an admonition about two groups, and you know, one may be a mistaken group. And so again, if anyone has already researched this, feel free to chime in. This is just a point of clarification that needs to be made, and we're going to talk about who the Edomi are in current times. So we've talked about this before, but we're going to go over that again. And so just for clarification, the Arameans are basically a member of an ancient Aramaic speaking people that inhabited an area, Aram, which is modern Syria. And so that's the group that this is talking about in terms of this clerical error. Now, what we have are depictions of the Arame and the Edomi. Now, what often happens, or what has historically happened, is that when individuals come from tribes or nation states in West Africa, there is the discounting of their oral tradition, their oral heritage that is passed down through time. And when this happens, there's a discounting of their reality, and there is the discounting of history. And so oral tradition does count as history. And one of the reasons why their oral tradition is discounted is likely because it ties them directly to the Bible, and it ties them directly to having possible Hebrew roots. The fact is, however, that they have a strong track record. The name of their nation state is the name of their claimed ancestor. The name of their nation state is a name that grows out of the what you would call the Hebrew family, and so they would be the children of Esau. And so Edomi or Edomite, that is another name for Esau, and it is related to the color red or ruddiness, also related to Adam. And so it's all pretty much, yes, Adam. It's all related to that same root and that same idea of red. And the IDU comes from the Greek, and the EDOM is coming from the Hebrew. And interestingly, oftentimes the individuals who do not listen to them regarding their heritage, those individuals tend to be other brown people who are pretty insistent that the Edomi are people over in Europe, and they only exist in Europe and nowhere else. When in fact the individuals, if they are existing in Europe, they are also related to the people that are on the screen. And sometimes that focus on skin color can, get confusing and make people discount reality. And so simply because someone has a different skin color doesn't mean that they are not biologically related. And so you have to be very careful about making assumptions about someone's ancestry based upon skin color alone. And you can even see in some of the words, some of the identifiers for some of the clans, you will see iterations of Esau, or you will see iterations of Edomi. So you'll see Isan, you might see Asan, like Asante. And so you can be on the lookout for all of those things, but they are there right in plain sight. There's nothing hidden. There's no secret going on. It's right there, and people are claiming their identities. But what happens is when individuals in West Africa or those groups claim those roots from the Levant, from the Middle East, from Asia, basically, there is a suggestion that they are making it up, or they are trying to make themselves look important, or that they are mistaken. But there are some pieces of archaeological evidence that tie them to the Middle East, tie them to the Egypt area. There are also some language dynamics that tie them, and there are also some biological dynamics. And so these groups would include people in Nigeria, people in Benin, people in Ghana. Now, one of the things that Ghana points out is that they have mixed in. They are related to the Israelites. They do identify themselves as Hebrew. They are related to the Israelites, and some Israelites have intermarried with them. So there is some mixing, and you can see that in some of the names too. But they don't necessarily identify themselves collectively as Israelites, but they do identify that they have traveled together with the Israelites, that they have been neighbors, those are their cousins, And in some instances, there are some that are actually inside of their groups. And some of the names you might see, there'll be Dan names, and we've talked about this before. So you'll see words that have DAN and DEN in them as their roots or the suffix, prefix. So you might want to be on the lookout for those sorts of things. And interestingly, those individuals who identify as white are more likely to identify people within what they understand as their collective. They're more likely to identify people who have things like Dan in their name, Danish, things like that. They're more likely to say, oh yes, that sounds reasonable, that is a part of their identity. But individuals who identify as brown or black or African American or Caribbean are more likely to say that the individuals in Africa with those same names, that it's not true, that it's a fiction. They'll go into this whole thing about the Bible being made up, and so therefore these identities are made up. But you are encouraged to have some sense of respect for the identity that people give themselves and their own sense of self-determination. So when someone tells you who they are, allow them to be whoever it is that they are saying they are, unless you have some really definitive proof that they are not. So this goes with those who are in Africa. This also goes with those who are identifying as Aboriginal in America. Now, the other individuals that you see on the screen with the white head wraps and the clergy, those are individuals of Syrian descent, and those would be the Arameans. Now, there is some confusion regarding Ouida, Benin, and the former kingdom of Ouida, Judah, Zuida, Huida, Fida. These are not the same things. Benin right now is sitting on the land that used to be the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Ouida. This is not the same thing. Right now in Benin, there's a little town, a little area along the coastal area there known as Ouida. And that's pretty much like a little holdover from the actual kingdom. There's a lot of conflation in historical narratives regarding the kingdom of Judah. And we'll just call it the kingdom of Judah so that it's not as confusing with, calling it Ouida and getting it confused with Benin and the former place for Dahomey. But there's a lot of confusion and conflation in historical narratives, which is very odd. There is a refusal on the part of some historians, to make the distinction between the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Dahomey and the country now of Benin. Now, Benin, when you look at their museum and their literature, they clearly identify that there is a distinction. They identify that they are not the kingdom of Judah and that they, in fact, took over. They conquered the kingdom of Judah. And we've talked about this also before. They conquered the kingdom of Judah and executed a large portion, thousands of the population, and then enslaved the other portions that they had access to. And so there is no confusion on the part of Benin about who Benin is and who the kingdom of Judah was. And also Oyo, the Yoruba, they are very clear, and the Akan are very clear on the fact that the kingdom of Judah is not there anymore, and that Benin is in the same physical location. And part of this confusion is probably coming from a similar dynamic where people are skeptical about this kingdom of Judah being there. unless of course the map makers, we're not saying that it's not possible, but unless of course the map makers were lying about it and historians were lying about there being a kingdom of Judah there in that coastal area, then there was a kingdom of Judah. For some odd reason, and we've discussed this before also, there is a word for this kingdom of Judah in a variety of languages. And for some strange reason, there is a need in many cultures to have a name for this Judah. So you'll see it in French and English and Dutch. You'll see it in all sorts of languages, which is interesting, but we've gone over that before, why that may be the case. And so just want to reiterate here, just because this does not fit with your religious paradigm or someone's religious paradigm, it doesn't mean that it doesn't fit with someone else's religious paradigm. And someone else's religious paradigm is just as important as anyone else's religious paradigm. And when you look at the historical narratives tend to support that there was a kingdom of Judah located there. And but there is some conflation, because you'll hear things about the religious practices, you'll hear things about the kings, and they will conflate the kings. They'll say that the king was doing certain things when the king was a child. And this kingdom was also very short-lived, and so it almost looks like a temporary kingdom. But many of the kingdoms on the west coast of Africa pretty much almost just sort of popped up at about the same time, which is very interesting. And so perhaps someone will do some research on why these kingdoms just suddenly popped up, and where did they pop up from? You know, where did these people come from? And why did they suddenly converge on the west coast of Africa around the same time? Now we have some historical questions for you to ponder. And first question is related to King James. And many people think of a Jacobite as someone who was simply a supporter of King James II, and that those who supported the Stuarts were all Jacobites. There is another Jacobite or Jacobi that is not related to supporting the Stuarts. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to quickly look at that and give you a task of answering a question. And the question is, was King James I and VI a Syrian Jacobite? Now, many individuals have pointed to issues between King James and the Catholic Church, and so this is a very relevant question, a very good question. Did any of that consternation result from King James' own religious identity? And so there's not a lot of clarity about his specific religious identity, but the fact that the word Jacobite is used in relation to King James, that family, the Stuart family, and Jacobite is actually related to an ancient church. There is the question of whether there is that relationship going on. There's also a group that believes that the Israelites, so this relates back to the Israelites again, there is a belief, it's a race-based belief, a color-based belief, that a number of the tribes went into Europe, and they went into Europe and then spread out and became the different kingdoms in Europe. And so there is some belief in a connection between Europe, and particularly Britain, and the Middle East. the Levant area. And so that is your task. And if you have any thoughts about that after you do a little research, you can put those comments in the comment section and have that discussion with other people. You might also want to consider doing your own video on that topic. Now, the next question is, if Lucy is born in Georgia and then Lucy resides for 10 years in Nevada and then Lucy retires in Texas, where is Lucy from? A number of people, scientists in particular, and of course Pan-Africanists, frequently assert this idea that everyone came out of Africa because Lucy was found in Africa. However, Lucy being found in Africa does not automatically mean that Lucy was birthed in Africa. The only thing you know about Lucy being found in Africa is that Lucy was found in Africa. You don't know if Lucy was transported to Africa. You don't know if Lucy transported herself to Africa. You don't know if Lucy was in Asia and then came to Africa, if Lucy was in Europe and came to Africa. All you know is that Lucy was found in Africa. And it is an erroneous assumption on the part of scientists to make that leap and then insist that Lucy was born in Africa. And there are several indications that the origins of humanity may have been a little further east, and so which would also go along with some other narratives, including the narratives of those from the west coast of Africa. And so another question to entertain is, are many Africans actually Asian? And when you look at the Kalahari San, you can see the features that they have, and they are pretty much the oldest people going right now. And so you can look at their features and you can see their phenotype is a phenotype that is traditionally thought of as an Asian phenotype. Also, a number of groups in West Africa have decidedly Asian features. They have an Asian phenotype. And so the question remains, are many Africans actually Asian? And so also, when you consider that, you also need to look at this question of the extent to which quote unquote African Americans are actually African American, or the extent to which they are Afro-Asiatic American or Eurasian American. And if people are willing to keep their minds open about all sorts of possibilities will emerge.
We'll put it together and we'll get it undone. Someday when your head is much lighter.
All right, well, today will not be the day when your head is much lighter if you are looking at this trust. And this is the Stairsteps trust. This is another issue that is similar to the issue of whether the United States is a country or a corporation. For some reason, going around the internet is this idea that this trust is some really mysterious trust, and it's related to the birth certificate and trading people again on the stock exchange and things like that. This Stairsteps trust is really just about a beneficiary, and it's related to a legal construct known as the rule against perpetuities. And so it's not anything nefarious that, that many people are believing. It's related to the measuring life. It's a very perhaps complex legal construct, but not really. And so it's really about the beneficiary of a trust. And it comes from England, their laws. The United States, by the way, is not bound by British law. Sometimes people see laws from all over the world and they may be led to believe that everyone is under all of the same laws, or if there used to be a British law, that it's still applicable in the United States. Well, it's only applicable if the United States allows it to be applicable, based upon our own legal system. However, this is all that it's really related to. And so a beneficiary is the person that the trust is basically created for. They are the person who are the entity that will benefit from the actual trust. And so again, sometimes people see things on the internet and they get very upset by them. These all sorts of things about the law, and instead of getting worked up when you see something that sounds, really out there, really just take the time. You can go to a law library. Again, you can speak to an attorney, and these are really basic questions. These are not like legal advice issues. You can just ask someone, hey, what is this all about? What does this word mean? What does it mean in practical terms? And 9 times out of 10, they will give you an answer. Now, to wrap this up, we have talked about the community guidelines. We've covered whether the United States is a country or a corporation. We've covered what is an Indian, an Aboriginal person, in terms of whether we're talking about race or status. We've talked about the distinction between an Aramee and Edomite, and that potential clerical error that is in the biblical translation. We've also clarified the distinction between Ouida, Benin, and the former kingdom of Ouida, Judah. We've also touched on the question of whether King James was a Jacobite or Jacobi. We've also touched on the question of whether African ancestry is perhaps actually Asian ancestry. And we finished with a brief discussion on the beneficiary issue related to trusts. And hopefully these clarifications will provide you with some insight to help you with your research or your understanding of your own status, also to facilitate further discussions and perhaps enhance the discussions that people are having, and maybe keep down some of these debates. Maybe with some clarity, people won't be so confused, and so people won't be so combative in terms of trying to identify other people. The other thing is again, an encouragement to allow other people to be who they are, and allow other people to have self-determination, the same sense of self-determination that you want for yourself. And we will be coming back with a discussion on locating your ancestors and looking at some very specific names that indicate ancestry on some of those passenger lists. And we're going to look at some of the meanings of these surnames and how those meanings can point you to who your ancestors might have been. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care and see you soon.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter.